Chapter 3. On board of this ship, one feeling seemed to pervade the minds of all who claimed to be Americans, that we were unlawfully seized without any provocation on our part, hence any way by which we could regain our liberty would be justifiable. In a few days the greater portion of the officers and crew took one of their number on shore to be buried. It was then suggested by some that this was a favorable time for us to break the iron bars and bolts on the porthole and make our escape by swimming in the strong current that was rushing by us. In breaking the bars we succeeded beyond our expectation, and when all ready to cast ourselves overboard, one after another the boats came alongside with the officers, and our open place was discovered. For this they began by taking one after another and whipping them on their naked backs in a most inhumane manner. This dreadful work was in progress for several hours, and ceased about 9 o'clock at night, intending to finish next day. But they did not have time to carry out their cruel work, for orders were given to tranship us all on board a frigate nearby that was weighing her anchors to put to sea. In a few days we came to Plymouth, where we were re-examined, and all such as were pronounced in good condition for service in the British Navy were transferred to one of their largest size stationary ships, called the St. Salvador del Mundo. On this monstrous floating castle were 1,500 persons in the same condition as myself. Here, in conversation with a young man from Massachusetts, we agreed to try to make our escape if we perish in the attempt. We prepared us a rope, and closely watched the soldiers and sailors on guard till they were being relieved from their posts at midnight. We then raised the hanging port about 18 inches and put the tackle fall in the hands of a friend in the secret to lower it down when we were beyond the reach of the musket balls. Our rope and blanket, about 30 feet long, reached the water. Forbes, my companion, whispered, "Will you follow?" I replied, "Yes." By the time we reached the water, I was slipping down after him when the alarm ran through the ship. "A man overboard!" Our friend dropped the port for fear of being detected, which left me exposed to the fire of the sentinels. But I was soon in the water and swam to a hiding place under the accommodation ladder by the time the boats were manned with lanterns to hunt us out. We watched for an opportunity to take an opposite direction from our pursuers, who were repeatedly hailed from the ship to know if they had found anyone. We had about 3 miles to swim with our clothes on except our jackets and shoes. These I had fastened on the back of my neck to screen me from a chance shot from the ship. An officer with men and lanterns descended the accommodation ladder, and sliding his hand over the slat, he touched my hand and immediately shouted, "Here's one of them! Come out of that, you sir! Here is another! Come out, you sir!" We swam round to them and were drawn upon the stage. "Who are you?" demanded the officer. "An American." "How dare you undertake to swim away from this ship? Did you not know that you were liable to be shot?" I answered that I was not a subject of King George, and had done this to gain my liberty. "Bring them up here," was the order from the ship. After another examination, we were put into close confinement with a number of criminals awaiting their punishment. After some 30 hours of close confinement, I was separated from my friend, and hurried away with about 150 sailors, all strangers to me, to join His Majesty's ship, Rodney, of 74 guns, whose crew numbered about 700 men. As soon as we had passed our muster on the quarterdeck of the Rodney, all were permitted to go below and get their dinners, but Bates. Commander Bolton handed the first lieutenant a paper, on reading which he looked at me and muttered, "Scoundrel." All the boat's crews, amounted to more than 100 men, were immediately assembled on the quarterdeck. Said Captain Bolton, "Do you see that fellow?" "Yes, sir." "If you ever allow him to get into one of your boats, I will flog every one of the boat's crew. Do you understand me?" Yes, sir," was the reply. "Then go down to your dinners, and you may too, sir." I now began to learn something of the nature of my punishment for attempting, in a quiet and peaceable manner, to quit His Majesty's service. In the commanding officer's view, this seemed to amount to an unpardonable crime, never to be forgotten. In a few hours the Rodney, under the cloud of sail, was leaving Old Plymouth in the distance, steering for the French coast to make war with the Frenchmen. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. Thus my hope of freedom from this oppressive state seemed to wane from my view like the land we were leaving in the distance. As our final destination was to join the British squadron in the Gulf of Leon in the Mediterranean Sea, we made a stop at Cadiz in Spain. Here the French troops of Napoleon Bonaparte were bombarding the city and British and Spanish ships of war in the harbor. These comprised a part of the Spanish fleet that finally escaped from the Battle of Trafalgar under Lord Nelson in 1805, and were now to be refitted by their ally, the English, and sail for Port Mahon in the Mediterranean. Unexpectedly, I was one of 50 selected to refit and man one of them, the Apollo. A few days after passing the Straits of Gibraltar, we encountered a most violent gale of wind called a levanter, common in those seas, which caused our ship to labor so excessively that it was with the utmost exertions at the pumps that we kept her from sinking. We were finally favored to return back to Gibraltar and refit. A number of Spanish officers with their families still belonged to the ship. It was wonderful and strange to us to see how tenaciously these people hung around their images, surrounded with burning wax candles, as though they could save them in this perilous hour, when nothing short of our continual labor at the pumps prevented the ship from sinking with us all. After refitting at Gibraltar, we sailed again and arrived safely at the island of Mahon. Here I made another attempt to regain my liberty with 2 others by inducing a native to take us to land in his market boat. After some 2 days and nights of fruitless labor to escape from the island by boats or otherwise, or from those who were well paid for apprehending deserters, we deemed it best to venture back. Our voluntary return to the ship was finally accepted as evidence that we did not design to desert from the service of King George III, and thus we escaped from being publicly whipped. Our crew was now taken back to Gibraltar to join the Rodney, our own ship, who had just arrived in charge of another Spanish line of battleship for Port Mahon, having a crew of 50 of the Rodney's men. In company with our Spanish consort, we sailed some 80 miles on our way to Malaga, where we discovered the combined armies of the English and Spanish in close engagement with the French army on the seaboard. Our ship was soon moored broadside to the shore. As the orders for furling the sails were not promptly obeyed by reason of the Frenchmen's shot from the fort, all hands were ordered aloft, and there remained exposed to the enemy's shot until the sails were furled. This was done out of anger. While in this condition a single well-directed shot might have killed a score, but fortunately none were shot till all had reached the deck. Our 32-pound balls made dreadful havoc for a little while in the enemy's ranks. Nevertheless, they soon managed to bring their enemies between us and thereby check our firing. Then, with a furious onset, they drove them to their fortress, and many, seeing our boats near the shore, rushed into the sea and were either shot by the French or drowned, except what the boats floated to our ship. This work commenced about 2 p.m. and closed with the setting sun. After disposing of the dead and washing their blood from the decks, we sailed away with our Spanish consort for Port Mahon. Just before reaching there, another levanter came on so suddenly that it was with much difficulty that we could manage our newly built ship. Our Spanish consort, unprepared for such a violent gale, was dashed to pieces on the rocks on the island of Sardinia, and nearly every one of the crew perished. After the gale, we joined the British fleet, consisting of about 30 line-of-battle ships, carrying from 80 to 130 guns apiece, besides frigates and sloops of war. Our work was to blockade a much larger fleet of French men-of-war, mostly in the harbor of Toulon. With these we occasionally had skirmishes or running fights. These were not prepared, neither disposed to meet the English in battle. To improve our mental faculties, when we had a few leisure moments from ship duty and naval tactics, we were furnished with a library of 2 choice books for every 10 men. We had 70 of these libraries in all. The first book was an abridgment of the life of Lord Nelson, calculated to inspire the minds with deeds of valor and the most summary way of disposing of an unyielding enemy. This one of 10 men could read when he had leisure during the last 6 days of each week. The second was a small Church of England prayer book for special use about 1 hour on the first day of the week. Church service on board a king's ship. As a general thing, a chaplain was allowed for every large ship. When the weather was pleasant, the quarterdeck was fitted with awnings, flags, benches, etc. for meeting. At 11 a.m. came the order from the officer of the deck. "Strike 6 bells there." "Yes, sir." "Boatswain's mate." "Sir." "Call all hands to church. Hurry them up there." These mates were required to carry a piece of rope in their pocket with which to start the sailors. Immediately their stentorian voices were heard sounding on the other decks. "Away up to church there, every soul of you, and take your prayer books with you." If anyone felt disinclined to such a mode of worship and attempted to evade the loud call to church, then look out for the men with the rope. When I was asked, "Of what religion are you?" I replied, "A Presbyterian." But I was now given to understand that there was no religious toleration on board the king's warships. "Only one denomination here. Away with you to church." The officers, before taking their seats, unbuckled their swords and dirks and piled them on the head of the capstan in the midst of the worshipping assembly, all ready to grasp them in a moment, if necessary, before the hour's service should close. When the benediction was pronounced, the officers clinched their sidearms and buckled them on for active service. The quarterdeck was immediately cleared, and the floating Bethel again became the same old weekly warship for 6 days and 23 hours more. Respecting the church service, the chaplain, or in his absence the captain, reads from the prayer book, and the officers and sailors respond. And when he read about the law of God, the loud response would fill the quarterdeck. "O Lord, incline our hearts to keep thy law." Poor, wicked, deluded souls! How little their hearts were inclined to keep the holy law of God, when almost every hour of the week their tongues were employed in blaspheming his holy name, and at the same time learning and practicing the way and manner of shooting, slaying, and sinking to the bottom of the ocean all that refused to surrender and become their prisoners, or who dared to oppose or array themselves in opposition to the proclamation of war issued from their good old Christian king. King George III not only assumed the right to impress American seamen to man his warships and fight his unjust battles, but he also required them to attend his church and learn to respond to his preachers. And whenever the band of musicians on shipboard commenced with "God Save the King," they, with all his loyal subjects, were also required to take off their hats in obeisance to his royal authority. At that time I felt a wicked spirit toward those who deprived me of my liberty and held me in this state of oppression and required me in their way to serve God and honor their king. But I thank God who teaches us to forgive and love our enemies, that through his rich mercy in Jesus Christ I have since found forgiveness of my sins, that all such feelings are subdued, and my only wish is that I could teach them the way of life and salvation. The winter rendezvous of the Mediterranean British squadron was on the Isle of Minorca, harbor of Port Mahon. Sailing after the middle of the 7th month is dangerous. See St. Paul's testimony in Acts 27, verses 9 and 10. While endeavoring to escape the vigilance of our pursuers, after we stepped out of the Spaniards' market boat, as before narrated, away beyond the city at the base of a rocky mountain, we discovered a wooden door which we opened, and away in the distance it appeared quite light. We ventured on through this subterranean passage till we came to a large open space, where the light was shining down through a small hole wrought from the top of the mountain down through the dome. This subterranean passage continued on in a winding direction, which we attempted to explore as far as we dared to for the want of light to return to the center. On both sides of this main road we discovered similar passages, all beyond our exploration. Afterward, we were told that this mountain had been excavated in past ages for the purpose of sheltering a besieged army. In the center or light place was a large house chiseled out of a rock, with doorway and window frames, designed undoubtedly for the officers of the besieged and rallying place of the army. After a close survey of this wonderful place, we became satisfied that we had now found a secure retreat from our pursuers, where we could breathe and talk aloud without fear of being heard or seized by any of the subjects of King George III. But alas, our joy soon vanished when we thought again that there was nothing here for us to eat. When we ventured to a farmhouse to seek for bread, the people eyed us with suspicion, and fearing they would seize us and hand us over to our pursuers, we avoided them until we became satisfied that it was in vain to attempt an escape from this place, and so returned to the ship. The stone of this mountain is a kind of sandstone, much harder than chalk, called holystone, which is abundant on the island and made use of by the British squadron to scour or holystone the decks with every morning to make them white and clean. In the mild seasons, the sailor's uniform was white duck frocks and trousers and straw hats. The discipline was to muster all hands at 9 o'clock in the morning, and if our dress was reported soiled or unclean, then all such were doomed to have their names put on the blacklist, and required to do all kinds of scouring, brass, iron, and filthy work in addition to their stated duty, depriving them of their allotted time for rest and sleep in their morning watch below. There was no punishment more dreaded and disgraceful to which we were daily liable. If sufficient changes of dress had been allowed us, and sufficient time to wash and dry the same, it would have been a great pleasure, and also a benefit to us, to have appeared daily with unsoiled white dress on, notwithstanding the dirty work we had to perform. I do not remember of ever being allowed more than 3 suits at one time to make changes, and then only one day in the week to cleanse them. About 2 hours before daylight once a week, all hands, about 700, called on the upper decks to wash and scrub clothes. Not more than 3/4 of these could be accommodated to do this work for themselves at a time. But no matter, when daylight came at the expiration of the 2 hours, all washed clothes were ordered to be hung on the clotheslines immediately. Some would say, "I have not been able to get water, nor a place to wash mine yet." I can't help that. Clear out your clothes and begin to holystone and wash the decks. Orders were most strict, that whoever should be found drying his clothes at any other but this time in the wash day should be punished. To avoid detection and punishment, I have scrubbed my trousers early in the morning and put them on and dried them. Not liking this method, I ventured at one time to hang up my wet trousers in a concealed place behind the main topsail. But the sail was ordered to be furled in a hurry, and the lieutenant discovered them. The main top men, about 50, were immediately ordered from their dinner hour to appear in the quarter-deck. "All here, sir," said the under-officer that mustered us. "Very well. Whose trousers are these found hanging in the main top?" I stepped forward from the ranks and said, "They are mine, sir." "Yours, are they, you—" And when he had finished cursing me, he asked me how they came there. "I hung them there to dry, sir." "You— See how I will hang you directly. Go down to your dinner, the rest of you," said he, "and call the chief boatswain's mate up here." Up he came in great haste from his dinner. "Have you got a rope's end in your pocket?" He began to feel and said, "No, sir." "Then away down below directly and get one, and give that fellow there one of the blank floggings he ever had." "Yes, sir, bear a hand." Thus far I had escaped all his threats of punishment from my first introduction into the ship. I had often applied for more clothes to enable me to muster with a clean dress, but had been refused. I expected now, according to his threats, that he would wreak his vengeance on me by having the flesh cut off my back for attempting to have a clean dress, when he knew I could not have it without venturing some way as I had done. While thoughts of the injustice of this matter were rapidly passing through my mind, he cried out, "Where is that fellow with the rope? Why don't he hurry up here?" At this instant he was heard rushing up from below. The lieutenant stopped short and turned to me, saying, "If you don't want one of the blank floggings you ever had, do you run?" I looked at him to see if he was in earnest. The under-officer, who seemed to feel the injustice of my case, repeated, "Run!" The lieutenant cried to the man with the rope, "Give it to him." "Aye, aye, sir." I bounded forward, and by the time he reached the head of the ship, I was over the bow, getting a position to receive him near down by the water on the ship's bobstays. He saw at a glance it would require his utmost skill to perform his pleasing task there. He therefore commanded me to come up to him. "No," said I, "if you want me, come here." In this position, the devil, the enemy of all righteousness, tempted me to seek a summary redress of my grievances. If he followed me and persisted in inflicting on me the threatened punishment, to grasp him and plunge him into the water. Of the many that stood above looking on, none spake to me that I remember but my pursuer. To the best of my memory, I remained in this position more than an hour. To the wonder of myself and others, the lieutenant issued no orders respecting me, neither questioned me afterward. Only the next morning I learned that I was numbered with the blacklist men for about 6 months. Thanks to the Father of all mercies for delivering me from premeditated destruction by his overruling providence in that trying hour. Ships belonging to the blockading squadron in the Mediterranean Sea were generally relieved and returned to England at the expiration of 3 years. Then the sailors were paid their wages and 24 hours' liberty given them to spend their money on shore. As the Rodney was now on her 3rd year out, my strong hope of freedom from the British yoke would often cheer me while looking forward to that one day's liberty in the which I was resolving to put forth every energy of my being to gain my freedom. About this time the fleet encountered a most dreadful storm in the Gulf of Lyons. For a while it was doubted whether any of us would ever see the rising of another sun. These huge ships would rise like mountains on the top of the coming sea and suddenly tumble again into the trough of the same, with such a dreadful crash that it seemed almost impossible they could ever rise again. They became unmanageable, and the mariners were at their wits' end. See the psalmist's description in Psalm 107, verses 23 to 30. On our arrival at Port Mahon, in the island of Minorca, 10 ships were reported much damaged. The Rodney was so badly damaged that the commander was ordered to get her ready to proceed to England. Joyful sound to us all. Homeward bound, 24 hours, liberty, was the joyous sound, all hearts glad. One evening after dark, just before the Rodney's departure for England, some 50 of us were called out by name and ordered to get our baggage ready and get into the boats. "What's the matter? Where are we going?" "On board the Swiftshore 74. "What? That ship has just arrived for a 3 years station." "Yes." A sad disappointment indeed. But what was still worse, I began to learn that I was doomed to drag out a miserable existence in the British Navy. Once more I was among strangers, but well known as one who had attempted to escape from the service of King George III.